Good evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Leah Hogg with our weekly current affairs briefing in English. We're joined from Boston by Professor Niko Passas, who is a criminal lawyer and a professor in criminal justice. Good evening, Professor.
Good evening to you.
Thank you very much. A lot happening in the US on the political front. And thank you for joining us to give us an update. What's happening after the second impeachment?
Well, a lot of things are happening. And one important note is that there are multiple investigations that are ongoing. And I think that the magnitude, the depth, the extent of planning, facilitation, and culpability for what happened last week is not yet fully revealed and fully known. I think it will be very important as a next step to have a little bit of evidence gathering and presenting it in an independent, objective way so that people finally realize what exactly happened. Because what happened last week is simply not fully known yet. As far as procedural developments are concerned, we had the impeachment yesterday for the second time, and the next step is for the Senate to pick it up and decide whether to convict or not. And after that decision, we have a conviction in particular, another consideration is going to be whether to take extra measures and, for example, bar those found responsible from political office in the future. That is not an automatic kind of sanction that comes with conviction on impeachment charges, but it has to be decided separately. Interestingly, that decision does not require the two-thirds majority that is necessary for conviction, but a simple majority can accomplish that. So part of the problem also is that what started violently in Washington, D.C. has precedents. We saw things similar like this take place in Michigan. And it was a kind of development that was fully expected, analyzed with reports and warnings all over the place. So the red flags about this, and especially with respect to finding, fomenting, promoting lies, and having a number of people further promoting it and giving it plausibility and legitimacy in the eyes of millions of people is bound to lead to developments like the ones that we saw yesterday. It's not something that happened just out of the blue. It is not something that has a single contributing factor, but it is a result of a culmination of processes, practices, decisions, and statements that have been made over the past months. Consequently, whatever happens on the 20th, when we have a new administration, a new president, and a new chapter in American history, the problems that started months ago, arguably years ago, are not going to end. And it is a long effort to deal with the deep-seated lack of confidence and mistrust, division, and extremism that is now quite widespread in the United States.
Sure. What damage has this done to the rule of law in the United States?
It's extraordinary and it's almost unthinkable. What you have here is principles about everyone being equal before the law, that you have equality before the law, equal access to justice. And here what you have is a blatant attempt to challenge the legitimacy of an election that was won by one candidate, by one party over the other, by more than 7 million votes. It is a result that, despite dozens of legal challenges in courts in multiple states, has been rejected outright by low courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And you have professionals, lawyers, politicians, influencers taking this lie and giving it some aura of plausibility, as if there was something to it. And you have millions of people who genuinely believe it. Now, this has implications for the rule of law, because these people feel justified in attempts to restore what they see as their right, which doesn't exist in this particular case. There was no extensive fraud. There was nothing that would change the result. And you have here, even after the events that we saw last week, a very large number of lawmakers voting to challenge the legitimacy, the appropriateness of an election process. That damages the rule of law, that damages the brand of the United States and its reputation around the world.
Do you see any problems? Do you foresee any problems on Inauguration Day next week?
Well, when you see the pictures in Washington, D.C. and in capitals around the country, they remind you of military regimes, of extraordinary instability and fear of violence, where armed forces are needed in order to protect and shelter people who go about their business and who go about celebrating a new administration that is coming into place. So the optics alone tell you that there are grounds to fear a risk of violence and of armed confrontations. The other red flag to me is that you have a series of big technology companies that decided to take extraordinary steps to exclude content and users from their platforms. I do not know that we will ever see precisely the evidence that led them to take this decision. And some people have questioned the way in which it was done. But to me, what this tells me is that they saw things that scared them. They saw things that were extremely detrimental to the security of this country, and they felt that they had to act.
But of course, I mean, we all know that there are many social media platforms. So, I mean, it can just go on and on. It's never ending, isn't it?
Well, it will go on until people come out and unambiguously explain to everyone what the facts are. I mean, we cannot have alternate reality become a dominant narrative and a dominant discourse on the part of people who are supposed to be leaders, who have a responsibility for the economy, for the health, and for the security of their constituents. So to me, people have taken an oath to serve under the Constitution and promote the common good. I hope that everyone is going to be reminded and will act with conscience and will be able to sleep well after they act on this. I don't think that everyone is doing this up to now.
Thank you, Professor. How are the financial markets reacting to this? And what do you foresee?
Well, that is another interesting phenomenon. The disjunction between the markets and the real economy has been absolutely extraordinary. Before the pandemic started, the markets were at extremely high valuations. We had, in other words, a bubble. We had a short, sharp correction for good reason. But after the measures taken by the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world, we have reached new heights and new records in all indices. And that tells you that at the same time, what we have is millions, tens of millions of people unemployed, millions of people threatened with eviction and foreclosures of their homes, millions of people who cannot make ends meet. And while trillions of dollars were allocated very quickly and bipartisanly to big companies and particular sectors, there was a lot of debate and brakes put before efforts for supporting much more vulnerable and much more numerous parts of the population. So the economy and the market do not tell the same story. They are completely apart, and this cannot end very well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Passas, for your input today. That was Professor Niko Passas from the United States, a specialist on criminology. Yesterday, I interviewed Dr. Herman Schiavone in Parliament with regards to the impeachment, the first impeachment. And here's a short clip. I'll be joined in the studio straight after by Dr. Edward Debono.
The events we experienced in the last few days in Washington were very upsetting. Upsetting not just for the American people, but also those who have democracy at heart around the world. One cannot draw any conclusions as to how these events will affect democracy in the United States and around the world. One would have to see how the legislatures, the senators, the congressmen in the Capitol, how they're going to react. And as we speak, the impeachment process is underway because the Americans cannot afford to have in future to experience what has been experienced in the last few days with any other president. So I expect that the second impeachment of Trump will be carried, and basically his political career is now over.
Thank you for being with us. I'm joined by Dr. Edward Debono, who's going to pick up from where we left off with Dr. Schiavone, because obviously things have taken place. Your comments after hearing Professor Passas and Dr. Schiavone?
I think both Professor Passas and Dr. Schiavone were correct in the analysis which they were making of the situation in the United States. Let us not forget that the United States is a country where millions of people throughout the centuries, particularly from the last century to this century, fought for democracy. They sent the boys and the men overseas to ensure that democracy reigns in the world. We Europeans, the World War II started changing in Europe after the Americans entered the war to save Europe from the ravages of Nazism. So what we have experienced during the past 3-4 years was one of the most anti-democratic stances a nation could pass through. When people besiege the seat of power, the Capitol in Washington, they are attacking the heart of the nation. And attacking the heart of the nation moved forward by Mr. Trump. Donald Trump incited these people to go and break down the Capitol because he lost power.
I mean, it couldn't be worse, really.
Couldn't be worse. Couldn't be worse. And what we're hearing is that there were security failures, there were incitements for violence, the radical right practically took over. They even entered the offices of Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Congress. They ravaged all that they could have found.
I mean,
And the person who's responsible for this is only Donald Trump. And yes, they were right in bringing forward an impeachment process in the United States. A second time, by the way, it wasn't the first time. Donald Trump was going to be impeached a first time last year. Now, this second impeachment, members of his own Republican Party, about 15, I think, 12 to 15 members, voted with the Democrats to pass on this bill for impeachment.
yes.
Listening to Donald Trump yesterday evening, after Nancy Pelosi read out from Congress the impeachment bill, you think that this guy is a saint. The way he tried to portray himself as the savior of democracy and putting people back to stop moving forward their ambitions and their intentions to overcome the rule of law, you say, am I listening to the right thing today? 3 days, 4 days after he incited them to go and actually break up all that there was in the Capitol.
Sure.
In actual fact, don't forget, he called them, they are so close to his heart, these people. It reminded me of Carmelo Bonici calling the dry docks workers the aristocracy of the workers.
I mean, until I have to say, until an hour ago, this came up on Reuters. He's still insisting that his speech was totally appropriate. So
it wasn't. It was definitely.
But that was
there are a lot of legal issues going to come up, because there are some who are stating that once he will be impeached after his term of office would run out and Mr. Biden would be appointed President of the United States, there couldn't be an impeachment because he's no longer President of the Republic. But one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, George Adams, Mr. Adams, in one of his discourses had stated that the president could also be impeached after his term of office comes to an end.
Sure.
You know, and obviously this makes sense, you know, and you can also see various parallels with what's happening in our little island, you know, having Mr. Muscat unable to appear before the Standards Committee because Mr. Speaker has decided that once he's no longer an MP, he cannot anymore appear before the committee. You can see that when the rule of law is played in this way, the state of Denmark is not being managed and administered correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, we